Elias Vance did not cry when his husband told a room full of powerful alphas that their marriage was nothing but obligation. He stood perfectly still, his gloved hand pressed flat against the cold marble column, and let the music swallow the words whole. The string quartet played something bright and French. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell like the tide. And in the middle of all that carefully constructed elegance, Julian Ashford, Elias's husband of 3 years, had just reduced their entire union to a footnote in a conversation about property acquisitions. Elias had loved this man in silence for 3 years. 3 years of waiting to matter. 3 years of presenting himself at functions, standing at Julian's side, smiling when the social script required it, and retreating into the background the moment the performance ended. He had done it all willingly because somewhere deep in his foolish heart, he had believed that if he was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough, Julian would eventually see him. That night, something inside him did not break. It closed. Quietly. Finally. The summer of 1816 arrived in Virginia like a slow fire, heavy and relentless. The fields around Ashford House shimmered under a white sky, and every family of consequence within 40 miles had driven their carriages toward the Harrington Assembly Hall. Elias Vance, born Elias Whitmore, a name he still carried inside him like a pressed flower, stood near the east column of the ballroom and watched the room move without him. He was 24 years old. He had been Mr. Julian Ashford's husband for 3 years. And in those 3 years, he had learned the particular art of being invisible inside a marriage. He wore a pale blue coat that evening, his dark hair pinned simply, no jewels except a small pearl at each ear. He stood straight. He always stood straight. It was the one thing his father had given him that Silas Harrow and county gossip and 3 years of cold silence had never managed to take. Across the room, his husband stood at the center of a circle of men. Julian Ashford was 33, tall enough to command space without trying, broad-shouldered, powerful. His scent reached Elias even from this distance, cedar and smoke and something underneath that was purely alpha, commanding and warm and utterly indifferent. The scent that had drawn Elias in from the very first moment, 3 years ago, when Julian had entered his father's crumbling house and made Elias feel, for the first time in months, like he might be safe. He had been wrong about that. Safety and visibility were not the same thing. Elias had not meant to move closer, but his feet carried him along the far edge of the room until he was close enough to catch the low current of conversation rising above the fiddle music. "Ashford," said one of the men, Preston Mercer, a land speculator from Richmond. "I've always wondered. The Whitmore boy you married, beneath the family name, no question. Was that entirely your own decision, or did your father arrange it?" "A family obligation," Julian said. His voice was even, unhurried. Nothing more. The Whitmore situation was difficult. The marriage was the practical solution. Laughter moved through the circle. Comfortable laughter. The laughter of men who found nothing remarkable in what had just been said. Elias stood with his hand pressed flat against the marble column. He did not move. He did not make a sound. The music continued, bright and indifferent, and Elias Whitmore stood at the edge of it all and felt the full weight of 3 years settle onto his shoulders at once. A family obligation. Nothing more. He turned and walked to the terrace. The night air was warm but thinner than the air inside, and it hit his face like the first honest thing he'd felt all evening. He gripped the stone railing with both hands and looked out over the dark garden where fireflies moved in slow drifts. Behind him, the music and voices continued as though nothing had occurred. Nothing had occurred. That was the precise nature of the wound. When the glass doors opened behind him, he did not turn around. "Elias." Julian's voice was careful. Not soft. Never soft. "The evening is nearly over. We should make our farewells." "Of course." Elias turned, smoothed his coat, and walked past Julian through the glass doors. He spent the next 40 minutes saying polite farewells with his back straight, and his voice steady, and his face arranged in such composed pleasantness that not a single person in that room would have guessed that something had just quietly ended inside him. The carriage ride back to Ashford House took nearly an hour. Julian sat across from him in the dark and offered him exactly what he always offered: polite silence. He was not cruel in obvious ways. He paid the bills and maintained Elias's wardrobe and kept the house comfortable. He had provided everything a husband was supposed to provide. What he did not give, what he had never given, not once in 3 years, was the simple act of looking at Elias like he mattered. Finally, because she was tired and because the evening had stripped away whatever remained of her restraint, Elias said, "Julian." "Yes. At the assembly tonight. Preston Mercer asked you about our marriage." A pause. "He asks about a great many things that are none of his concern. You called it a family obligation." Julian held his gaze for a moment in the darkness. "It is an accurate description of the arrangement." "Yes," Elias said. "I know." He turned back to the window. Julian said nothing further. When they arrived, Julian stepped down first and offered Elias his hand, as he always did. Elias took it as he always did, with the practiced composure of an Omega who had learned to accept exactly what was offered and ask for nothing more. He went upstairs alone. He sat at the edge of his bed in the dark, still in his pale blue coat, and pressed his palms flat against his knees. He had loved this man since he was 19 years old. He had loved him when his family's name began to fall apart, when his father's debts came due, and the counties started whispering, when he had nothing left to offer except himself. Julian had married him. Julian had given him protection and position and his name. Julian had never once looked at him like he was worth looking at. Elias sat in the dark for a long time. Then something happened that had not happened before. He stopped waiting. Not dramatically, quieter than that. The way a door closes when the latch finally settles. Not slammed. Simply resting into the frame with a small and final click. He was done. The next morning, Julian's mother came down to breakfast. Margaret Ashford was 61 years old, a woman built from Virginia granite and old money contempt, and she had made her opinion of the Whitmore marriage known from the moment Julian had announced it. She had never once allowed Elias to forget that he had arrived at this table with nothing and had therefore earned nothing. Elias was already seated, back straight, hands composed around his coffee cup. Whatever had happened inside him last night remained private and his own. Julian came in 3 minutes later, moving with unhurried authority. He took his chair at the head of the table. Margaret unfolded her napkin and said without looking up, "I heard you were on the terrace alone for quite some time last night." The Mercer women were talking. "The evening was warm," Elias said. "An Omega who leaves his Alpha's side at an assembly invites commentary. You ought to know that by now." Margaret lifted her coffee cup. "Your mother was never known for her social judgment. I suppose these things are learned at home." Elias said nothing. He had heard variations of this speech many times. But from across the table, Julian said, "That is enough, Mother." Margaret looked at her son. "I am simply observing." "You are simply making observations you have made before," Julian said. "Elias is Mr. Ashford. That is the end of the matter." The table settled into silence. Elias looked at his husband for one long moment. He waited to feel something warm at those words, some proof that the defense meant what it sounded like. But Julian had already returned to his food, his expression unchanged. Julian had not defended him. Julian had defended the Ashford name. Elias was Mr. Ashford. That was the extent of it. "Thank you," Elias said, "because courtesy required it." "It is nothing," Julian said, because that was precisely what it was. The morning after, Elias rose before anyone else was awake. He changed into simple clothes, pulled his hair back without ceremony, and walked out the back of Ashford House while the dew was still on the grass. He walked to the tenant plots. The first family he encountered was the Coopers, husband and wife for children, a leaking roof that had already rotted 2 of the interior support beams. Gideon Cooper was standing outside, looking at the roof with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem that had no good solution. "Mr. Cooper," Elias said, "how long has that beam been like that?" The tenant looked at him with cautious uncertainty. Sir, since spring. We've patched it twice, but the wood's gone bad. Do you have timber? Some. Not enough. I'll speak to the estate manager, Elias said. What else do you need? Gideon stared at him. Elias looked at him steadily. I'm asking you directly. What else does your family need? By the time the morning was half gone, Elias had walked the entire eastern row of tenant plots. He had a list inside his head of roof repairs and medicine shortages and a family, the Aldridges, whose youngest child had been running a fever for 2 weeks. He went back to the house and found Thomas, the estate manager. I need timber allocated for the Cooper roof, Elias said, and I need to know why the Aldridge child has not been seen by a physician. Thomas looked uncomfortable. The estate budget is managed by my husband. I know. I'm asking what the practical obstacle is. The practical obstacle is that no one has authorized it, sir. I'm authorizing it. Elias looked at him steadily. I am the master of this house. Put it on the household account. If Mr. Ashford objects, tell him I instructed you. Thomas opened his mouth. Elias looked at him steadily. Thomas closed his mouth. Yes, sir. Elias spent every subsequent day that week among the tenant families. He brought food when the kitchen had surplus. He organized the older children to carry supplies. He sat with Margaret Aldridge while the fever broke in her youngest daughter, and he held the child's hand and said quiet things about hope. Nobody in the main house particularly noticed. Julian rode out in a different direction. Margaret spent her mornings writing correspondence. The servants moved around Elias's new routine with quiet adaptability. But on the eastern edge of the Ashford land, something was different. People had started to look at Elias the way nobody in the main house had looked at him since he arrived. Like he was there. It was on a Thursday, the second week of July, that Elias first properly met Dr. Samuel Reed. Samuel arrived at the Aldridge cottage with his bag and his rolled sleeves and the particular brisk competence of a physician who had learned to use his time without waste. He was 29, not tall but precise in his movements, with an open face and pleasant, unobtrusive scent, something clean and herbal like sage and rain. Mr. Ashford, Samuel said, shaking his hand without the careful hesitation that most alphas applied to omegas of his station. I heard the Aldridge girl is improving. She is, Elias said. I wanted you to see her yourself. Samuel examined June with thoroughness and asked Elias quiet questions as he worked. Elias answered with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention. When Samuel finished, he straightened and looked at Elias. You kept good records. You probably saved this child from a secondary infection. I couldn't wait, Elias said. Samuel looked at him for a moment. No, he said. I can see that. They walked back along the tenant road together in the morning heat, talking with the ease of two people who have discovered, unexpectedly, that they are thinking about the same things. It was the first conversation Elias had held in 3 years where he had not felt himself translating every word through the filter of what an omega in his position was supposed to sound like. 3 days later, Julian came home from riding the northern acreage and found his husband standing at the edge of the Cooper field, talking with Dr. Samuel Reed. Elias was laughing, fully and without restraint, his head tilted slightly back, his whole face open. Julian pulled his horse to a stop. He sat very still. Elias had not looked like that in 3 years. Julian had not known, until that precise moment, that he had never seen his husband's face look like that. Something moved through him that he did not have an immediate name for. It was not pleasant. He rode on without stopping. But that evening at supper, he watched Elias across the table. Elias was talking quietly with Thomas about the eastern well, his hands moving when he talked. He spoke without the careful deference he used with most of the house. He spoke like someone who had made a decision and was communicating it clearly. He did not look at Julian, and the absence of those glances sat in the center of Julian's chest like a stone dropped into still water. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Julian lay awake in the dark and thought about his husband. Morning came with Thomas at the door before 8. Mr. Ashford has requested the Eastern crews be redirected for 3 days to clear the well, Thomas said, and the Cooper timber, and the medicine run to the Jennings family. He's been directing the household account toward the tenant plots for about 2 weeks now. Julian said nothing for a moment. He told you to charge it to the household account? Yes, sir. Then it's authorized. Julian walked downstairs. Elias was not at the breakfast table. He had already gone out. Julian found out from the kitchen girl that Mr. Ashford had been rising before sunup every morning for 2 weeks, walking the eastern plots before the heat peaked, that the tenant families had started keeping a watch for him. Julian ate breakfast alone. The empty chair across from him had a different quality than it usually did. Margaret came in late. I saw Elias going out again this morning, she said. An omega of his position does not spend his mornings in tenant fields. It is undignified. Julian put down his fork. The Cooper roof has needed attention since spring. The Aldridge child nearly died. Those are failures of this estate's management, not of my husband's dignity. Margaret looked up surprised. He is involving himself in things. They are absolutely his concern. Julian heard the words come out with more force than he had intended. He is the master of this house. He pushed back from the table and went to find Elias. He found Elias at the Jennings plot, kneeling beside an older woman, helping her sort through a basket of dried herbs. Elias was entirely present in that moment, entirely given over to it, and there was something in the quality of his attention that made Julian stop. Elias did not look up. He did not hear Julian. Julian watched his husband for a long moment. Then Mrs. Jennings looked up and saw him. Elias turned. He looked at Julian across the yard with an expression that was composed but not closed, simpler than that. The way you look at someone who has appeared somewhere you didn't expect them. Julian, Elias said. Elias. Julian nodded to Mrs. Jennings. Ma'am. There was a silence that had too many things in it for its length. I spoke with Thomas, Julian said. About the well and the Cooper roof. I know, Elias said. You should have told me directly. Something moved across Elias's face. Not anger, quieter than that. I tried telling you things directly for 3 years. I found it was more efficient to simply do them. Julian held his gaze. The crews will be redirected for 3 days, he said. The well will be shored before the end of the week. Thank you, Elias said. He turned back to Mrs. Jennings. Julian walked back toward the main house in the summer heat with a feeling of an alpha who has just walked into a room and discovered he is not the most important person in it, and that this discovery has arrived approximately 3 years too late. The following Saturday, word had gone through the county that Dr. Samuel Reed will be holding a medical consultation at the Cooper's barn. Elias had helped organize it. By 10 o'clock, 7 families had gathered. By 11, there were 12. Samuel worked steadily through them, and Elias moved between the families with the ease of someone who had spent enough time among them to know their names. He translated between Samuel's medical language and the plain English of people who had never had a physician explain things to them directly. Samuel noticed. You're good at this. You understand what people need before they can say it. That's not learned. That's who you are. Elias looked at him. He did not know what to do with being seen that clearly. Thank you, Dr. Reed, Elias said. Samuel, he said. I think we've reorganized enough medicine baskets together that you might manage my first name. Elias almost smiled. Julian heard about the barn consultation from Thomas. He heard that 12 families had attended. He heard that his husband had organized the entire thing, and that Mr. Ashford and Dr. Reed had been seen walking back along the tenant road together afterward, talking with the ease of 2 people who had found in each other's company something they were in no hurry to give up. Julian stood and walked to the window that faced east. He had married Elias Whitmore because Elias had needed protecting, and Julian had been in a position to provide it. He had told himself that was sufficient reason. Standing at the window, he recognized for the first time that it was not the whole truth. He had married Elias because on the one evening he had met him at his father's house, Elias had sat across from him and said with complete honesty that he thought the Ashford family banking practice of charging interest on inherited debt was a form of cruelty dressed in legal language. And Elias had said, looking directly at Julian, and he had not apologized. Julian had thought about Elias for 2 months before the situation with his father's debts made action necessary. He had told himself the action was purely practical. He had never stopped to examine what was underneath the practicality. Because examining, it meant admitting that an alpha who had spent his entire life believing emotion was weakness had been privately moved. And that an omega of no particular wealth had managed to walk past the wall Julian had built and touch something real. He had punished Elias for it. Not deliberately, but in the daily accumulation of silence and distance, and the steady withholding of the one thing Elias had deserved from the beginning, the acknowledgement that he was not a duty but a choice. 2 days later, Samuel rode out to the estate to follow up on June Aldrich. He found Elias already there. June was entirely well, loudly opinionated about the examination. On the road back, Samuel and Elias walked their usual pace. "How are you, Elias?" Samuel asked. "Not the social version. The actual version." Elias considered it honestly. "Better. Differently than before." "Differently how?" "Before, I felt like I was waiting for my life to begin. Now I feel like this is it. This is the actual thing." He looked at the road ahead. "It's enough. It might be more than enough." They came around a bend and stopped. Julian was on his horse at the far end of the road, sitting very still, the absolute stillness of an alpha keeping something down by sheer force of practice. He had seen them walking close together, easy and unguarded. "Mr. Ashford," Samuel nodded. "Doctor." Julian's voice was even. "Julian," Elias said. "Elias." There was a silence with real weight in it. "The Aldrich girl is well," Samuel said. "Fully recovered. Your husband's early intervention made the difference." Julian looked at Elias. Something moved in his expression, not coldness, not the practice distance. Something more complicated. Something that looked, for a fraction of a second, almost like pain. "I'm glad to hear it," Julian said. He looked at Samuel. "Thank you for your work on this estate." "My pleasure, sir." Julian wheeled his horse and rode toward the main house without another word. Samuel watched him go. "He's not what I expected." "No," Elias said. "He rarely is." That evening, Julian came to find Elias in the small sitting room off the east hallway, reading one of his father's old botanical books, the one thing he had brought from home that he allowed himself to call his own. Julian knocked at the open door. He came in and stood with his hands behind his back. "The tenant work you've been doing. I wanted to say it has been well done." "Thank you," Elias said. Julian nodded. He did not move to leave. Elias watched him trying to find the door to whatever room he had come in here to enter, and not finding it. "Is there something else?" Elias said, not unkindly. "No." "Then yes. I don't know." Elias had never heard his husband say those words in that order. "You seem different," Julian said finally. "These past weeks." "I am different," Elias said. "How?" Elias set the book down. "I stopped waiting for permission to matter. That's the whole of it. I stopped waiting for this house to tell me I belonged here. I stopped waiting for you." Julian stood very still. "I'm not angry," Elias said. "I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because it's what happened. I used to spend my days trying to be visible to you. And then I walked out one morning and found that I was visible to people who had nothing to gain from seeing me. And something in me settled. Like it found the ground for the first time." Julian looked at his husband for a long time. Really looked, the way he had not allowed himself to look. He opened his mouth, closed it. Nodded once with the controlled precision of an alpha absorbing a truth that was costing him something. "I'll let you read," he said quietly. He walked out. 3 days passed. Elias rose early, walked the eastern plots, brought food to the Coopers, checked on June, sat with Mrs. Jennings learning the names of herbs. He was building something solid in himself. Samuel came out on Thursday again. When they finished, he said there was a county gathering the following Saturday at the Patton Farm, a summer fair that brought together half the families within 20 miles. "I'll be there," Samuel said. "Will you come?" "Expected," Elias said. Samuel smiled. "Expected is one thing. Coming because you want to is another." "Then yes, I want to come." Saturday morning, Elias came downstairs to find Julian already waiting. They drove to the Patton farm in the same carriage. The silence had a different texture than before, not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had too much to say and had not yet worked out how. At the fair, Elias moved through the crowd with steadiness he had not possessed 2 months ago. He greeted people by name, and they greeted him back not with cautious deference but with warmth. Julian kept pace beside him, watching. Samuel found him near the food tables around mid-morning. Then the fiddle started up, a reel, bright and fast. Samuel turned to Elias. "Would you dance, Mr. Ashford?" Elias said yes. He did not look at Julian. He took Samuel's hand, and they moved to the open ground, and Elias danced the way he had not danced since before his father's debts, with his whole self in it, his face open and unguarded. Samuel made him laugh twice during the reel. From the edge of the ground, Julian watched. He watched his husband laugh, watched Samuel Reed place one hand at Elias's back with the easy confidence of an alpha who had no reason to be afraid of touching something that might mean something to him. Julian felt the full weight of jealousy, not because another alpha was dancing with his omega, but because another alpha knew how to be present with Elias and Julian did not. The reel ended. Elias came back across the ground, bright from the movement. "You dance well," Julian said. "I used to," Elias said. "I think I'm remembering how." And then from the far edge of the fair, a voice came through the crowd. "Well, Elias Whitmore." "Still wearing the Ashford name, I see." Silas Harrow walked through the crowd, broad-shouldered, confident, the largest creditor in the room, the alpha who had wanted to marry Elias when he was 19. Elias had refused him. Silas had never forgotten. "Heard you've been spending your time with the tenant farmers," Silas said with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "Given your family's situation, I suppose you have a natural sympathy for people who owe more than they can pay." Elias looked at Silas Harrow. He did not step back. He stood exactly where he was. "Mr. Harrow." "Good morning." "Is it?" Silas smiled wider. "I often wonder what your husband's family thinks about having the Whitmore name attached to theirs." "I'm sure you do wonder," Elias said. "You've always been very interested in my family's business." Silas leaned forward. "I recall a conversation with your father 8 years ago." "That is enough." Julian stepped forward, placing himself between Elias and Silas. "You will address my husband as Mr. Ashford. You will confine that address to civil topics. And you will not reference his family's past in public or private again." Silas looked at him. "Julian, I know every financial arrangement you have made in this county for the past 15 years, Julian said, voice level. "I know about the Caldwell property, the lien on the Morrison estate, the arrangement with Judge Peters. I would prefer to keep that knowledge where it currently resides. Whether it stays there depends entirely on how this conversation ends." The silence that followed had the quality of a room after a door has been slammed. Silas's smile changed, became the smile of a man reassessing. "Always a pleasure, Julian." He walked away. Elias stood very still. Julian turned to him, and Elias saw something in his face he had not seen before. Worry, plain and unguarded, there for 1 second before he contained it. "Are you all right?" Julian said. "Yes," Elias said. Julian nodded. Samuel appeared at Elias's shoulder. "Well, that man has the particular charm of a boot in a wound." Elias let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I've been fine around Silas Harrow before." "No," Julian said quietly. "You haven't." He was looking at the ground, his voice flat. "You've managed him before." That's not the same as fine. Then he walked away toward the edge of the fair, leaving Elias with the echo of those words. Elias found the letter 3 days later. It was not something he was looking for. He had gone into Julian's library to return a book. The book dislodged something from the space behind it. A folded paper fell to the floor. When Elias bent to pick it up, he saw his own name on the outside, in his father's handwriting. He opened it. His father had written it 2 months before the wedding. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters moving with effort. When he reached the end, he understood his father had not arranged the marriage. Julian had. Silas Harrow had moved against the Whitmore estate through a series of debt consolidations, positioning himself to foreclose on everything and offer Elias's father a single way out, marriage to a business associate. Julian had learned of it. He had gone to Elias's father and proposed the alternative. He would assume the Whitmore debts in full and marry Elias not as a transaction but as protection. I am telling you this because you deserve to know that you were chosen, Elias. Not as a remedy. Not as an obligation. The obligation came later, when Julian could not find the courage to be honest about the first thing. But the first thing was a choice freely made. Elias stood in the library for a long time. He read the letter twice, then a third time. He thought about the ballroom and the carriage and the breakfast table and all the 1,000 daily silences he had read as indifference, and that now were beginning to rearrange themselves into something that looked less like coldness and more like fear. He was still sitting there an hour later when Julian came in. Julian saw the letter. He stopped in the doorway. "You knew," Elias said. "About Silas." Julian said nothing. "You went to my father. Before I ever knew any of it was happening." "Julian, why didn't you tell me?" Julian came into the room. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel indebted. I knew if you knew the full circumstances, you would feel as though you owed me something. As though the marriage was a debt to be repaid instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of what?" Julian looked at him. "Instead of what it was meant to be." "What was it meant to be?" Julian held his gaze for a long moment. Elias could see the war in him, and he watched Julian lose it. "More than it became," Julian said quietly. "A great deal more than it became." Elias looked at his husband, this complicated, armored, frightened alpha who had protected him from a threat he'd never known existed, and then spent 3 years punishing both of them for the fact that he had done it. He felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness. Not anger. Something older. The feeling of beginning to see someone clearly. "I need time to think," Elias said. "I know," Julian said. Elias did not sleep that night. He got up before the house was awake and went to the kitchen. He stood at the window in the early gray light, thinking about the word chosen. He had been chosen by an alpha who then spent 3 years behaving as though he had signed a contract, who had given Elias every material comfort and withheld every human warmth, who had known about Silas Harrow and stood between Elias and that threat at every turn, silently, without acknowledgement, the way an alpha tends something in the dark because he cannot yet bring himself to tend it in the light. Elias understood Julian now. The understanding did not absolve him. Elias was clear on that. 3 years of feeling invisible were not erased by a revelation. But something had opened in him. A small, careful opening. He was still at the kitchen window when he heard Julian's footsteps. Julian stopped when he saw Elias. He had not slept either. He waited. "Sit down," Elias said. Julian sat at the kitchen table. Elias sat across from him. "I want to understand something," Elias said. "And I need you to answer me honestly. Did you love me? Before the marriage? When you went to my father?" The word landed between them. Julian looked at his hands, then at Elias. "I didn't have a name for it. I met you once at your father's house. You told me what you thought about the interest rates on inherited debt. I thought about that conversation for 2 months. When I heard what Silas was doing, I knew what I was going to do before I'd finished hearing the full account. I went to your father the next morning. He looked at Elias steadily. That is not how an alpha behaves about a business arrangement. No, Elias said. It isn't. I told myself it was practical. I was very good at telling myself that. I was good at a great many things that were not, in the end, true. Why didn't you tell me after? Because I didn't know how to tell you that I married you for reasons I couldn't fully account for without admitting that I was not, in fact, in control of my reasons. Your father, Elias said. My father believed that any feeling an alpha could not justify in practical terms was a weakness to be corrected. Julian stopped. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it because you asked me to be honest. It doesn't excuse 3 years, Elias said. No, it doesn't. It doesn't excuse the ballroom. It doesn't excuse sitting across from you every morning and treating you like furniture. Julian flinched. Elias saw it. I also need you to know, Elias said, that I believe you. About my father's letter. About why you went to him. I'm not forgiving you. That's not what this is. But I believe you. Julian looked at his husband. You are a great deal stronger than I gave you credit for. Yes, Elias said. I know. The week that followed was the strangest of their marriage. Nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. Julian began to appear on the eastern plots. Not dramatically, he simply appeared the way an alpha appears when he has decided to go somewhere. He worked alongside the estate crews on the Cooper roof, stopped when people spoke to him, listened, answered questions. He looked at the Aldridge children and asked them their names. Elias watched from a careful distance. He had built something solid in himself, and he was not going to let it erode because his husband had finally decided to look at the people on his own land. But he watched. On Wednesday, Julian came to find Elias at the Jennings cottage. Thomas says the creek boundary needs surveying. I'm riding out this afternoon. I wondered if you'd come. Why? Because you know the eastern land better than I do. And because I would like your company. Elias looked at him. All right. They rode out through the thick summer heat. It was the first time they had gone somewhere together that was not a social obligation. There was no performance required, just the two of them and the land. They talked about the creek, the drainage problem, the tenant family's boundary dispute. I'll settle it this week, Julian said. In the legal favor, which is the Marsh's favor, they'll be relieved. They should have been relieved 12 years ago. You can't fix everything at once, Elias said. No, but I can start. They rode in silence. Then Julian said, I owe Samuel Reed an apology. He's been a good friend to you, and I have not been generous about it. No, Elias said. You haven't. I was jealous. I'm not claiming it was fair. I'm telling you it was real. Everything I didn't say, it was real. I just had no idea how to say it. Elias looked at his husband. I know. That doesn't mean it's enough. I know that too. I'm not asking for enough. I'm asking for the chance to find out what enough might look like. One condition, Elias said. Honesty. Not politeness. Not management. The actual thing. All of it. I don't care if it's uncomfortable. I need the actual thing. Julian met his eyes. Yes, that's everything. 3 days later, Margaret crossed the line. At supper, she set down her fork and said, I heard you've been seen riding alone with Dr. Reed on more than one occasion. Elias set down his own fork. Samuel has come with me twice to follow up on medical cases. I know what it looks like, Margaret said. And so does the county. Margaret. Julian's voice was quiet. I'm simply observing that an Omega who rides alone with an Alpha who is not her husband has been doing necessary work on this estate while his husband was not paying sufficient attention, Julian said. The failure here is mine, not his, and I will not allow you to redistribute it. He looked at his mother. Elias is the master of this house, not because of my name, because of who he is, and I should have said that clearly a long time ago. He looked at Elias. I'm saying it now. Elias looked at his husband. Thank you, Julian. Margaret left the table early. Nobody commented. The following morning, Julian was gone before Elias came downstairs. He had ridden to town. He came back in the late afternoon and came straight to Elias in the east sitting room. "I went to speak with Eli Calloway," Julian said, "about Silas Harrow, the Caldwell property, the Morrison lien, the arrangement with Judge Peters." He sat across from Elias. "I gave Calloway full documentation. He's taking it to the circuit court." Elias stared at him. "Julian, if Silas retaliates, he'll try. I've prepared for it." Julian held his gaze. "He has been using your family's debt as leverage for 8 years. I should have moved against him years ago. I didn't because I was protecting the Ashford name from the complexity. I was protecting the wrong thing. This could get complicated." "Yes. He has friends on the court. So do I. More of them." "You're certain?" "No. I'm committed. Those are different things, and I'm done pretending they're the same." Elias felt something move in his chest, wider than the small opening of the morning after the letter. The recognition that the person across from him was finally, at real cost, trying to be equal to what he deserved. "Tell me everything Calloway said," Elias said. Julian talked for an hour. The room went from late afternoon to early evening around them, without either of them noticing. At some point, they had stopped sitting across from each other, and were sitting beside each other on the same settee. Elias's father's botanical book was on the cushion between them. Julian picked it up. "I should have made sure you had more of his things. When we married, I should have thought about what it cost you to leave that house." "Yes," Elias said. "You should have. I'm sorry." 2 words, plain as creek water. No hitch, no escape route. "I know," Elias said. The circuit court date arrived on a Tuesday in late August. Elias had been part of the preparation. Julian had brought him into it deliberately, explaining the documents, the legal structure, every piece of evidence. "You'll come to the court," Julian said the night before. It was not a question. "Yes. Silas will try to use your family's history. I've been waiting for it to stop coming for 8 years. I can manage one more time." Julian looked at him. "You won't have to manage it alone." Elias held his gaze. "I know." The county courthouse was full. Silas Harrow sat across the room with his attorney, settled and assured. Elias sat beside Julian in the front section, back straight, hands in his lap. Eli Calloway opened with the Caldwell property documentation, then the Morrison lien, then the arrangement with Judge Peters, documented in Peters' own hand. Silas's attorney objected 3 times. The judge overruled all 3. Then Silas's attorney stood. "Your Honor, I would like to note that Mr. Ashford's marriage to the son of Robert Whitmore, whose outstanding debts to Mr. Harrow remain active, represents a direct financial conflict of interest." Elias felt Julian go still beside him. Elias put his hand on the bench between them, not touching, just placing it there. Julian looked down at it, and something in his jaw released. Calloway was on his feet. "The Whitmore debt is precisely the mechanism by which Mr. Harrow maintained improper leverage. Far from representing a conflict, it represents the direct injury my client sustained." "Do you wish to proceed on that line?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Silas's attorney said. The proceeding continued for another 2 hours. When it concluded, Judge Hargrove ruled that the matters would be referred to the full circuit court for review, and that a lien freeze was being placed on all active Harrow debt instruments, including the outstanding Whitmore estate debt. Silas Harrow left the courthouse without looking at anyone. He left like an alpha who was already calculating what he had left to work with. And the difference was visible to anyone who had watched him long enough to know what he looked like when the ground had shifted under him. Outside in the August heat, people came to speak to Julian. A woman took Elias's hand and said, "My alpha lost the Caldwell property. We've been waiting for someone to bring this forward." "It was my husband's doing," Elias said. "Yours too, I think," she said, and walked away. Samuel appeared at Elias's shoulder. "That was something." "Yes. The Whitmore debt freeze. Calloway timed that beautifully. Julian made sure it was in the petition." He told Calloway it was a condition. Samuel looked at him. He's not the alpha I thought he was. No, he's not. Are you all right? Yes. Elias paused. I'm more than all right. I think I'm well. Samuel smiled. Good. That's the one I was hoping for. Julian found them. He nodded to Samuel. Reed, thank you for coming. Of course. I owe you an apology. I was unfair to you over the summer. The work you did with the families with my husband, it was good work, and I was not generous about it. Samuel looked at him. Apology accepted. For what it's worth, your husband did most of the work. I just showed up with a bag. Julian looked at Elias. Yes, he said. He did. The weeks that followed moved with the quality of things changing too slowly to watch, but too significantly to miss. The lean freeze held. Silas's attorney began negotiating terms, which meant Silas knew he was going to lose. Margaret had been quiet since the supper table confrontation. Not warm, but simply neutral. And neutral was a great improvement. Julian was different in ways that were small, but not small. He knocked before entering rooms. He asked Elias's opinion. When Elias disagreed with him, Julian argued plainly and directly, the way two people argue when they are both taking the matter seriously. Twice Elias changed Julian's mind, and Julian said so. Elias noticed all of it. He did not comment on it. He simply received it. And inside, quietly, he was beginning to build something he had stopped trusting himself to build. Not the waiting kind of love, but something more mutual. Something with room in it for who Julian was and who he was becoming. The Harrington Assembly came around again in September. The same hall, the same polished floors, the same fiddle music. 1 year almost exactly. Elias dressed with care, a deep green coat, his mother's pearls at his ears, his hair simply pinned. Julian was waiting in the hall. He looked at Elias fully, without the managed distance. You look well. Thank you. So do you. Julian offered his arm, and Elias took it. The silence between them had changed. It was the silence of two people who have things to say and are choosing when to say them. At the assembly, people greeted Elias differently. Not dramatically, but differently. Mrs. Harrington said his name first, before Julian's. The Aldriches crossed the room to speak to him. The woman from the courthouse squeezed his hand again. Elias moved through the room with the particular ease of an Omega, who no longer needed the room's approval to believe he belonged. Julian stayed near him, present, actually present, the way he had not been for 3 years. When Elias spoke about the tenant families and the well project, Julian listened, added things, looked at Elias with the expression of an alpha discovering that the person he married contained more than he had allowed himself to find out. Then the fiddle started up. The same reel. Elias stood very still for a moment, the memory of the marble column and the cold railing, and his husband's voice reducing him to obligation. Then he felt Julian's hand at his elbow. Not gripping. Simply there. Dance with me, Julian said. 2 words. No ornament. No escape route. Elias looked at his husband. He thought about the Omega he had been a year ago. The morning he had walked out to the Cooper field, not knowing what he was walking toward. Mrs. Jennings and June Aldrich, and the herbs and the well. His father's letter, you were chosen, Elias. He looked at Julian Ashford. Yes, he said. Julian took his hand and walked with him to the center of the floor. The fiddle moved into the reel, and they danced. It was not a perfect dance. Julian was not a natural dancer, and Elias found this unexpectedly delightful, because it meant Julian was doing something he was not certain of because Elias had said yes. Julian held his hand and moved with him. He did not look at the room. He looked at Elias, only at Elias. And what the room saw was not an alpha managing a social obligation. What they saw was an alpha who could not look away from the Omega he was with. When the reel ended, Julian did not release his hand. I want to say something, he said, not quietly, clearly. The room shifted into listening. Julian looked at the room, then at Elias. Most of you know my husband spent this past summer working on the eastern tenant plots. He organized the medical consultations that caught the fever outbreak before it spread. He directed the well repair. He repaired relationships I had let fall into neglect. He did all of it without being asked, without recognition, without his husband showing a fraction of the attention it deserved. The room was very quiet. I called this Omega an obligation once. In this room, a year ago, I was wrong. Wrong about what he is to me. Wrong about what I owed him. Wrong about the kind of alpha I had been choosing to be. He held Elias's gaze. He is the reason Ashford House is what it is this year rather than what it was last year. He is the most capable, most honest, most genuinely good person I have had the privilege of knowing. And I'm asking him to believe that I understand the difference now between what I gave him and what he deserved. And that I intend to spend however long he allows me making that difference smaller. Every day, Elias looked at his husband. He felt the year behind him. All of it. Julian, he said. Yes. That was a very long speech for an alpha who didn't use to say anything. Julian laughed, really laughed, in the middle of the floor, in front of the entire county, with no management of it at all. I had a good teacher, he said. Elias reached up and placed his hand flat against Julian's chest. Take me home, Julian. Julian covered his hand with his own. Yes, sir. They left the assembly early. In the carriage, they sat on the same side. The road back to Ashford House was the same road through the same summer dark under the same half moon that had been there a year ago, when Elias had sat across from his husband in the silence of two people who had everything between them and were not saying any of it. He sat beside Julian now and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is not the end of something, but the real beginning of it. Not the declared beginning, but the quiet and honest beginning that happens when two people have done the hard work of becoming honest with each other. Julian's hand was over Elias's on the seat. They did not talk, but this silence was different from every silence that had come before it. It was the silence of two people who know they will talk later, tomorrow, next week, for as long as they are given. Ashford House appeared at the end of the drive, lit from inside. It looked different than it used to, not the building, but how Elias received the sight of it. It was not the house he had arrived at 3 years ago, feeling like a charity case. It was the house he had made his own, room by room, morning by morning, choice by choice. He had not waited for Ashford House to accept him. He had claimed it. And now the alpha who owned it, who had always, it turned out, wanted him to have it, was sitting beside him with his hand over Elias's. They went inside together. The door closed behind them. And Elias Whitmore, who had once pressed his palm flat against a marble column and held himself together by will alone while the music played on without him, walked through his own front door with his husband's hand in his. He was home, and he did not need anything or anyone to tell him so. The Omega who had been called an obligation became the Omega who built a home. And that was the truest, most complete, most irreversible thing about him. Not what he had been given, not what he had endured, but what he had chosen daily and without apology to become. Extra story. Elias woke before dawn, as he always did now. The room was still dark, the summer heat already pressing against the windows, even at this hour. Beside him, Julian slept in the particular stillness of an alpha who had finally, after years of holding himself rigid against the world, learned to relax in the presence of another person. His arm was draped across Elias's waist, his breath warm against the back of Elias's neck, his scent, cedar and smoke, wrapped around Elias like a blanket that had been folded too long and was only now being allowed to unfold. Elias lay very still, not wanting to wake him. 3 months since the assembly. 3 months since Julian had stood in the middle of the Harrington ballroom and told the entire county that he had been wrong. 3 months since they had come home together, and the door had closed behind them, and everything had, quietly and irrevocably, changed. Elias still woke sometimes in the middle of the night with a memory of the marble column cold against his palm, the music bright and indifferent, Julian's voice saying a family obligation, nothing more. The memory had lost its sharp edges, but it was still there. It would always be there, he thought. That was the nature of wounds that had healed. They left scars, and scars remembered. But the scars did not hurt the way they used to. Julian stirred behind him, his arm tightening slightly. A low sound rumbled in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a word. Something in between. Something alpha and sleepy and entirely unguarded. Elias smiled in the dark. "You're awake." "No," Julian said. His voice was rough with sleep. "I'm not. You just made a sound." "I made no such sound, Julian." "I heard you." Julian pulled him closer, pressing his face into the curve of Elias's neck. His lips brushed against the scent gland there, not marking, not claiming, just present, just there. A small, deliberate gesture of connection that Julian had never made before this summer, and that Elias was still learning to receive without catching his breath. "You're thinking," Julian said against his skin. "I'm always thinking. You're thinking about something that makes you quiet? That's different from your usual thinking." Elias turned in his arms, shifting so he could see Julian's face in the growing gray light. Julian's eyes were open now, clear and focused in that particular way he had, the way that made Elias feel like he was the only person in any room Julian entered. "I was thinking about last year," Elias said. "About the assembly. About the marble column." Julian's voice was flat, but not cold. Flat in the way of a man who had made peace with the worst version of himself and was no longer trying to hide it. "I think about it, too. More than I should. Does it still feel the same?" Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he reached up and touched Elias's face, his thumb tracing along Elias's jaw, his palm warm against Elias's cheek. "No," he said. "It doesn't feel the same. It feels like something I did to someone I was too afraid to love properly. And that's," he paused, "that's not comfortable. But it's honest. And I promised you honesty." Elias leaned into the touch. "You did. Are you sorry?" Julian asked. "That you married me?" Elias looked at him. The question was not asked for reassurance. Julian did not do reassurance, not the kind that needed to be fed and tended like a fire. But the question was asked because Julian had learned to ask, which was more than he had ever done before. "No," Elias said. "I'm not sorry. I would have been 3 months ago. But I'm not now. Not sorry at all. Not sorry that I married you." Elias reached up and covered Julian's hand with his own. "I'm sorry that it took me 3 years to stop waiting. I'm sorry that I let your silence convince me I wasn't worth seeing. I'm sorry that I built a wall of my own in response to yours, and we lived on opposite sides of it for so long. But I'm not sorry I married you." Julian's expression did something complicated. Elias had become familiar with the complicated expressions over the past months. They were Julian's version of openness, the places where the control cracked just enough to let the truth through. "You should be," Julian said quietly. "I gave you nothing. You gave me protection," Elias said. "You gave me your name. You gave me a house that I learned to make a home. And eventually, you gave me the truth." He paused. "I could have left. I could have walked away the night of the ballroom and never come back. I didn't. Why?" Elias thought about it honestly, the way he had learned to do. "Because I loved you. Even when you didn't deserve it. Even when I thought you would never see me. I loved you, and I couldn't stop, and that was the most inconvenient thing I have ever carried." Julian's hand tightened on his face. "I don't deserve you." "No," Elias agreed. "You don't. But I'm not asking you to deserve me. I'm asking you to keep being the alpha who stood up in front of everyone and told the truth. I'm asking you to keep being the alpha who goes to the tenant plots every morning and knows every child's name. I'm asking you to keep waking up beside me and staying." Julian kissed him then. Not a hard kiss, not a desperate one. A slow, deliberate kiss, the kind of kiss that said things that words could not quite manage. When he pulled back, his scent had deepened, cedar and smoke and something warmer underneath. Something that smelled like home. I will, Julian said. I will keep being that alpha. Every day. For as long as you let me. They rose together with the sun, dressing in the quiet, companionable way that had become their new routine. Julian helped Elias with the fastenings on his coat. A small thing, but Elias had noticed that Julian had started doing it deliberately, seeking small ways to be present, to touch, to remind them both that the distance was gone. Downstairs, the breakfast table had been set. Margaret was already there, which was unusual. She had started coming down earlier since the assembly, though she had not explained why. She looked up when they entered together, and her expression was unreadable. Elias had made peace with Margaret. Not friendship, they were not the kind of people who became friends. But a kind of truce, a mutual acknowledgement that the social architecture of the house had changed, and that Margaret was no longer the authority she had once been. She had not apologized, and Elias did not expect her to. But she had stopped making the comments, stopped referencing his mother, stopped treating him like an interloper. That was enough. Elias, Margaret said, and the word was not warm but not cold either. It was simply her way of acknowledging his presence. Julian. Mother, Julian said. He pulled out Elias's chair before taking his own. A small gesture, but Elias noticed the way Margaret's eyes followed it, the way she registered the change and said nothing. Breakfast was quiet. Thomas came in halfway through with estate business. The Cooper roof was finally finished. The well was running clear. The Aldridge child had started attending the small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of the property. Elias listened and asked questions and gave instructions. Julian listened and added things and deferred to Elias's judgment on the tenant matters. It had become their rhythm. Elias knew the eastern land better now, and Julian knew it, and they had learned to work as partners rather than as master and subordinate. After breakfast, they walked out together toward the tenant plots. The morning was already warm, but the heat had not yet reached its peak. Fireflies still flickered in the tall grass at the edges of the road, and the fields stretched out green and heavy under the rising sun. Samuel Reed was already at the Aldridge cottage when they arrived, examining the younger Aldridge boy's leg, a minor sprain from falling out of a tree, nothing serious. He straightened when he saw them. Mr. Ashford. Mr. Ashford. Samuel nodded to each of them in turn. Good morning. Samuel, Elias said. Samuel, Julian echoed. And then, because he had been practicing, any news from the county? Samuel told them about a new family who had moved into the area, about the spread of a mild fever through the next county over, about the circuit court updates that Silas Harrow's attorney was slowly working through. Elias listened. Julian listened. They stood together in the morning sun with the Aldridge children running past them, June's voice loud and clear, her color good. She had come back from the edge of something terrible, and she was alive and loud and stubborn. Elias had helped save her. That was not a small thing. Samuel finished his examination and packed his bag. I'll be back next week, he said. If anything changes, we'll send word, Elias said. They walked Samuel to his horse. Julian shook his hand, a firm, deliberate handshake, the gesture of an alpha who had moved past jealousy and into something closer to gratitude. Thank you for your work, Julian said. Thank your husband, Samuel said. He's the one who keeps me busy. Julian looked at Elias. I know, he said. I do. They walked back to the main house through the tenant road, unhurried. Elias's hand brushed against Julian's, and Julian caught it, took it properly, held it as they walked. The road was quiet. The fields were green. The house at the end of the drive was lit warm against the summer morning, and it was home. I want to build something, Julian said. On the eastern land. Elias looked at him. What kind of something? A proper schoolhouse, Julian said. Not just the small room they're using now. Something with space. With books. With an actual teacher who stays. He paused. I should have done it before. I should have done a lot of things before. But I'm asking you now. Would you help me? Would you be part of it? Elias looked at his husband. The alpha who had once called him an obligation. The alpha who had spent 3 years locked behind a wall. The alpha who had told the truth in front of the entire county, who had defended Elias in court, who had learned to wake up and stay and touch and speak. The alpha who would become, slowly and with great effort, someone worth loving. Yes, Elias said. I would. And I think, he paused. I think I would like to be part of more than that. The estate. The decisions. All of it. Julian stopped walking. He turned to face Elias fully. You are already part of all of it. You always have been. He stopped, started again. I just didn't let you know it. I know, Elias said. But I'm saying it now. I want to be part of it. All of it. I want to be the master of this house in every way that matters, not just in the title. Julian looked at him for a long moment. Then he lifted Elias's hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to Elias's knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and formal that Elias almost laughed. You are, Julian said against his hand. You have been. You are everything. Elias looked at his husband. The morning sun was behind Julian, casting him in gold. The fields stretched out around them, green and alive. The house waited at the end of the road, and the summer stretched ahead of them, long and full of possibility. He stepped closer and kissed Julian properly, standing in the middle of the tenant road with the whole world around them. Let's go home, Elias said. Julian nodded. Yes. They walked the rest of the way together, hand in hand. And the road that had once been the road of silence became the road of everything else. The Omega who had been called an obligation became the Omega who built a home. And the Alpha who had been too afraid to speak learned to say everything. They did not fix each other. They were not broken in ways that could be fixed. But they learned to stand beside each other, and that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.